Gregor is senior research associate in the philosophy department at the University of Ljubljana. He just concluded a research project on the theatricality of power. He co-founded Aufhebung International Hegelian Association and served as its first president. And he's the author of Hegel and Spinoza, Substance and Negativity. Today he will talk on the contingency in Hegel and Spinoza. Gregor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martin. The controversial parts, obviously, in Spinoza, contingency in Spinoza, it's going to be a little crazy, all right? So, yes, it's obviously a controversial topic. Science and philosophy in general are not concerned with contingency, with chance, with luck. They are concerned with the necessity, with that which is necessary. And on top of this, Hegel and Spinoza, among philosophers, are Parmenidean thinkers in the sense that for them, contingency seems to be nothing but an illusion. They are also Parmenidean thinkers in the sense that we can detect in their respective systems the general principle of identity of being and thinking. I'm obviously speaking about on a very general level. Let us take a closer look first at Hegel. The most obvious example of such an apparent identity of being and thinking is the formulation from the preface to the Philosophy of Right. It's found elsewhere as well. What is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. Now, is there a place for contingency in such a system? Yes, it is, of course. As Bernard Mabie, author of a magisterial work on contingency in Hegel, he writes that it would be a mistake to read Hegel's sentence, this sentence, to mean a simple and immediate identity. According to Mabie, the mistake lies in confusing reality with actuality. Mabie points to a comment in the Encyclopedia Logic where Hegel discusses the identity of actual and rational and gives a bit more substance to it. Not in the technical term of the word. So Hegel writes, but even for someone possessing an ordinary sensitivity, which means like even for an ordinary guy, I suppose, a contingent concrete existence, eine zufällige Existenz, will not be deemed to deserve the emphatic designation of being actual. A contingent concrete existence has no greater value than something that is possible and which may just as well not exist as exist. And commenting on these lines, Bernard Mabie argues that contingency certainly has a specific form of reality in Hegel's system, the reality of something merely possible. But at the same time, that this reality is ultimately not the reality of the actual, of the Wirkliche. And in truth, Hegel does consistently quote Plato's system of ideas as a reference point to his phrasing of identity of rationality and actuality. And furthermore, Hegel consistently argued that the task of philosophy is precisely the operation that overcomes contingency and deals only with necessity. It thus seems that contingency has ultimately no ontological value for Hegel. But Bernard Mabie puts us on the right path by insisting that Hegel perceived quite well that contingency, Zufälligkeit, is a real challenge to philosophy. That's basically the title of his book. And that it has always been, even for Plato and Aristoteles. Mabie describes contingency as, quote unquote, I think it's just a beautiful description of contingency, the germ of death in the heart of our flesh, end of quote. This is a very interesting quote. And he sees the task of philosophy precisely as the task of giving an account of contingency, as answering the challenge of contingency, which is no less than a challenge to the idea that God is good or that the world is rational. So quite a lot is at stake. And we can recognize in this the hint at the question of evil in the world and of what Leibniz calls theodicy. And we will come back to this in a moment. To make a much longer argument short and present it very schematically, my claim is that what interests Hegel is not a complete elimination of contingency, but rather what he calls overcoming, Überwindung. So what does this mean? Hegel declares, the contingent is in general such as has the ground of its being not in itself, but in another. This is the form, Gestalt, in which the actuality first presents itself to consciousness. This is almost like a Spinozist version of it. The contingent, however, is merely the actual in the one-sided form of the reflection into another, or the actual with the meaning of something merely possible. Again, a very Spinozistic description. Now, overcoming the contingent, this zufällige zu überwinden, so construed, is generally the task of knowing, on the one hand, as much as it is the domain of practice on the other. It is a matter of not standing pat with the contingency of willing or arbitrary choice. End of quotation. So I'm really interested in the second part of this quote. The task of erkennen, of the process of knowledge, is to overcome the contingent, while at the same time not to stubbornly stick to the arbitrary. I find this formulation really important because what Hegel means with Zufälligkeit, the contingency, is not to be confused with mere arbitrariness. Properly understood, the process of knowledge is the process of overcoming the contingency. It is not that one must first overcome contingency in order for the process of knowledge to start in the proper meaning of the term. No. The process of knowledge, this would be my claim, is nothing but the process of overcoming the contingency. I argue, therefore, that contingency in Hegel must be understood as a necessary part of the relationship between the contingent and the necessary. So there is a necessity of contingency itself in Hegel, because the process of knowledge is precisely the process of working with the contingency. Now, to take on the question of theodicy, let us turn to Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of world history. There, the name for the process of working the contingency, for the process of overcoming the contingency, is simply repetition. Julius Caesar had to be repeated, so to speak, in Octavian Caesar and in all other Caesars that followed, precisely in order so that the idea of the rule of one would establish itself as not merely something historically contingent, but rather as something necessary. In other words, contingency is not to be eliminated or discarded in the process of knowledge. It has to be sacrificed on the altar of the idea. An idea can only establish itself through this process of the overcoming of the contingency. And it is for Hegel a bloody process, as we well know. So what this idea of repetition makes clear is another very intriguing aspect of the relationship between contingency and necessity in Hegel. Before Julius Caesar was repeated in Octavian, he was simply a contingent military leader who challenged the Republic. It was only in the repetition that he became a historical necessity, and what Hegel calls the world historical individual. In other words, becoming a necessity is a retroactive process. The point is not just that Caesar personally did not know what the future will bring when he crossed the Rubicon and submitted himself to the throw of the dice. It is the historical process itself which only retroactively receives its necessary shape. In other words, the grand claim that I want to make with respect to Hegel is that contingency is an integral part or a necessary part of the historical process. Contingency is ingrained in the very fabric of that which is. So, in one word, contingency does have a place on the ontological level. Maybe that's not that crazy. Maybe this is something that we all know. Maybe this is something that has been well discussed within Hegelian scholarship. But what about Spinoza? This is, of course, the much harder nut to crack. is it possible to claim that contingency has any ontological relevancy when we know that the substance is eternal and that God could not have been different, and so on and so on? So within the Hegelian field, of course, there is a great number of serious works written on the question of contingency, and of course Hegel himself wrote some of them, but I was able to find only a handful of articles discussing the topic in Spinoza. And even those are quite often part of actually Leibniz scholarship. Why is that so? It seems that Spinoza gives us a very good reason for this, which is, in nature there is nothing contingent, but all things have been determined from the necessity of the divine nature to exist and produce an effect in a certain way. Okay, case closed, we can go home, right? So everything I will say from this point onwards is obviously going to be crazy. I know this, so please, and it's a thought that I'm entertaining, and I'm inviting you to entertain it with me. Okay, so we know that this is going to be crazy. To make things even clearer, Spinoza declares in the first scholium to proposition 33 that on the ontological level he permits no contingency. Nothing is merely possible, everything is completely determined by its causes. Everything is either necessary or impossible. I mean, he makes that point many times. However, as soon as Spinoza moves to the human capacity to understand nature and its phenomena, things get complicated. Spinoza writes, but a thing is called contingent only because of a defect of our knowledge. Spinoza situates contingency in a defect of human knowledge. It is very clear what Spinoza is saying, I think, here. Things only appear to us as contingent, whereas in truth, on the ontological level, they are not. Or in Spinoza's own words, for if we do not know the thing's essence involves a contradiction, or if we do know very well that its essence does not involve a contradiction and nevertheless can affirm nothing certainly about its existence, because the order of causes is hidden from us, it can never seem to us either necessary or impossible, and so this is the reason we call it contingent or possible. It's kind of a complicated phrase, but it's, I think, very clear at the same time. So we call something contingent or possible only because the order of causes is hidden from us. We simply do not know the causes, and therefore we claim that something is contingent. So things are contingent or possible only for us, for our defective vision, while in themselves, or as they are conceived in the divine mind, they are always either necessary or impossible. Whether we phrase this in terms of ontology versus epistemology, or in a Kantian sense as a question of the difference between the thing in itself and the thing for us, Spinoza goes at great length to assure us that contingency never touches the substance itself. To claim otherwise would be to commit an obvious heresy. And as I mentioned earlier, many commentators have analyzed the criticism of Spinoza's concept of contingency that Leibniz made. But as our dear friend Vittorio Morfino, and I'm very happy that he's here, as our dear friend Vittorio Morfino elegantly shows, the critique of Leibniz is not really pertinent to what Spinoza says. But the really interesting thing, the reason why I quote Morfino is because Morfino points out that Spinoza denies contingency of particular things not only on the level of causal relationship, since particular things are always fully determinate, but also and perhaps especially in the sense that they are not essentially contingent, or not contingent by definition. So there's different ideas of what contingency could mean. But ultimately, Morfino argues that one could nevertheless speak about a radical contingency of things in Spinoza. He does. I did find someone who does that, and I absolutely support the crazy. I think this is clear. So Morfino, being very careful and cautious, suggests that this could be inferred from the way things are radically dependent, both in their essence and in their being, on the divine power. This does not mean that God can intervene at any point in a vertical act of free choice. Spinoza is, of course, very critical of the theological tradition that presupposes divine free will. Instead, what Morfino calls radical contingency of things is, I quote, so this is from Morfino, radical contingency of things is precisely the fact that the essence and existence of each mode is given and can be thought of only within the complex web that is the ever-changing and never once for all given effect of divine self-production. So I take Morfino here to mean that the particular things are radically contingent to the extent that divine self-production produces an effect which is ever-changing and self-producing. Morfino stops short of claiming that it is God himself who, in this self-production, should be considered as ever-changing. And he elaborates a bit further and concludes his article with the following thought. Again, a quote from Morfino. Insofar as Proposition 25 holds that the very essence of things depends on God, Spinoza affirms the contingency of the form of things. And it is precisely the contingency of form that I propose to call radical contingency, understanding cum tangere in the dual sense of having relationship to and occurring, happening. That is, Spinoza argues, and this is one of the most beautiful things I've read in Spinoza scholarship, that is, Spinoza argues that the existence of all form, including that of man, is necessary only post festum. And this necessity has nothing essential about it, so the necessity has nothing essential about it, that is, it does not realize a pre-existing essence, but depends only on the complex relational web that produced its emergence, end of quote. So the important point for me is the idea of a post festum necessity, a necessity which is only established post festum, or an emergent but not pre-existing necessity. Morfino, again, is very careful in making sure that he's only talking about the contingency of existing things. Nevertheless, by explaining the concept of necessity in this way, as a post festum necessity, I think the genie has already been released from the bottle. As soon as we accept that, I mean, it changes how we perceive Spinoza's system in general, I think. Such a post festum necessity is precisely what I was discussing earlier, I think, with reference to Hegel as the logic of historical repetition. When I said that historical necessity of the rise of individual called Julius Caesar is a necessity only retroactively. This same point could be expressed in the following terms as well. It is not that Spinoza's God is simply that which is given, implying a passive quality of a thing in itself, but rather that Spinoza's God is that which we must conclude that was given, retaining in itself the quality of being pure activity. So it seems to me, and this is what I want to add on top of what Morfino said in his text, that with Spinoza, we come infinitely close to the Parmenidean identity of being and thought, but just as in the case of Hegel, we must conclude that such an identity can only be thought on the background of a strange retroactive temporality. Okay, and I'll give another example of crazy and bizarre thinker, which kind of supports the crazy. And you will be surprised by who he is. It is none other than Pierre Macheret. Really. In a text which is less known and even less debated by Pierre Macheret, it's called, the text is called Spinoza, End of History and the Rules of Reason. I kid you not. You probably know it, but no one comments it. Okay, but before going there, let me discuss specifically the question of divine providence, because I mentioned earlier that this is something that it's a kind of a fil rouge here. So let us take a look at Spinoza's criticism of divine providence. Discussing the question of whether contingency can be considered a cause, Aristotle famously discusses the example of stone falling and hitting someone. This is when Aristotle discusses, aitia kata simebekos, whether this could be possible. But this same example, this Aristotle's example, is picked up by Spinoza in order to dismiss the notion of divine providence. So Spinoza writes, is a bit long example, but it's pretty fun, so let me read it. So Spinoza writes, for example, if a stone has fallen from a roof on someone's head and killed him, they, the followers of the doctrine of divine providence, will show in the following way that the stone fell in order to kill the man. For if it did not fall to that end, God willing it, how could so many circumstances have concurred by chance? For often many circumstances do concur at once. Perhaps you will answer that it happened because the wind was blowing hard and the man was walking that way, but they will persist. Why was the wind blowing hard and at that time? Why was the man walking that way at the same time? And if you answer again that the wind arose then because of the preceding day, while the weather was still calm, the sea began to toss, and then that the man had been invited by a friend, they will press on, for there is no end to the question which can be asked. But why was the sea tossing? Why was the man invited just at that time? And so they will not stop asking for the causes of causes until you take refuge in the will of God, that is the sanctuary of ignorance. So it's a fun quote, right? Now, we can immediately notice that divine providence is a strange ally of Spinoza. It's a strange ally of Spinoza because just as Spinoza himself, divine providence also seeks to eliminate the notion of chance occurrence, okay? So it couldn't have been a chance, God willed it, right? They are strange allies. And Spinoza is critical of the idea of God acting out of free will, which is ultimately why he rejects divine providence tout court. However, the only answer Spinoza offers us to this endless series of questions, why, which, in the end lead Leibniz to ask, but why is there being rather than nothing, like a small child, right? The only answer that Spinoza gives us is that God determined it so. Instead of God willed it so, Spinoza can only give us the answer, well, God determined it so. This is the only possible answer we can infer from Spinoza. In other words, it seems to me that Spinoza does not even deny the legitimacy of cutting this endless series of questions and causes by taking a refuge in God. Spinoza seems to be satisfied with a much more limited claim that God is not the transient but immanent cause of any such chain, whether we believe that such chain has a beginning or not. And I want to note here that Hegel would actually be just as eager as Spinoza was in rejecting the doctrine of divine providence. Okay, so Hegel is also not like a naive adherent to the idea of divine providence. If one applied it to the example of God pushing the stone and killing someone, this is what Hegel called the external teleology, and he ridiculed it with the same vigor as Spinoza ridiculed it. So, but what Hegel described as the inner purposiveness of the process of knowledge is the idea that we might apply to Spinoza as well. Namely, that the necessity of that process is established only in the retrospect. So I have just one more page. That's 4 minutes. That's good? Okay. All right. So now I want to mention the other heretic, the other crazy guy, Pierre Macheret, surprisingly. Macheret begins his crazy text where he discusses the question of rules of reason within Spinoza by pointing out that in the political treatise, as well as in the theological political treatise, Spinoza assumes that he is speaking from a point of view of history which is already finished. However, at the same time, Macheret absolutely rejects that Spinoza is suggesting that philosophers should satisfy themselves merely with the pleasure of knowledge. This ultimately leads Macheret to write, I'll show you some crazy. Macheret says, it must be said then that in a sense, history is never finished. He puts it directly. But that history always pursues, beyond its current forms, a movement of production which, if it alters none of its essential conditions, indefinitely varies the forms in which the latter are realized. So Spinoza's realism, the idea of speaking from the point of view of already finished history, Spinoza's realism leads him to consider an open history, for which any present moment never has anything but the relative nature of an occasional manifestation, and not that of an absolute expression. History is endless and without ends, because it necessarily depends on causes which always act in it, whatever the conjunctures that establish the concept of their, whatever the conjunctures that establish the context of their interventions. End of quote. So Macheret thus arrives to an apparently contradictory claim that Spinoza discusses the openness of history or the open-endedness of historical process precisely through the adoption of the perspective of a supposedly already finished history. And the only way Macheret, for Macheret to think through this apparent contradiction is ultimately the Hegelian way, through a special version of the idea of the rules of reason. In Spinoza, Macheret says, the idea of the rules of reason takes the meaning that behind all collective motivations, one must find, I quote, the necessary because strictly causal determination of the passions, end of quote. And furthermore, Macheret argues in an Althusserian manner that the process of right, of law, of justice, in political sense, is a process without the subject, a very clear Althusserian phrase, which I take to mean that the historical political process is ultimately outside of the domain of particular individuals and their passions or affects. So Macheret does not quite put this into words, but the apparent contradiction between the openness of history on the one hand and its already finished state in the analysis on the other hand is precisely what I phrased in reference to Hegel as the problem of the retrospective, even retroactive temporality of the actuality. And so even if Spinoza's metaphysics vehemently denies that contingency has an ontological dimension and rejects the idea of divine providence in the sense of external teleology as ludicrous, we could, I suggest, argue that Spinoza would perhaps not object entirely to Hegel's specific take on these two notions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gregor. I'm sure there are questions. Okay. Okay, Giovanna, Zanan.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Gregor. And actually, I just want to... Can? No,
Yes.
it's work. No, it's my fault. So I'm not convinced that... I mean, I want to ask you if you can say a little bit more, because when you talk about Spinoza and you talk about this characteristics of this post festum necessity of contingency, that in this way we can understand contingency in this post festum, and you want to somehow put this in relation to Hegel, and then in relation to Hegel, then you talk about this historical acts, historical gesture. But it seems to me there is something lacking there, because one of the characteristics of the historical gestures is that occurs in one moment. You can say this is totally rational, but just because it's totally rational, it also contains the possibility to become irrational, because in the historical development. So there is this thing that is rational in one moment on the point of view of the historical development, for the point of view of the spirit of the world, but then it can change. And I don't see this in Spinoza. So, and also now you finish with this openness of history. So I just want to see if you can say a little bit more about this.
Right. So again, I'd have to stress that this is, I'm just entertaining a thought here. And I think that both Spinoza and Morfino, which I quote, are careful enough, to say that on the metaphysical level, you probably cannot discuss this because it doesn't make any sense, because it would, just Spinoza wouldn't be Spinoza anymore. But the reason why Macheret discusses history is because if he wants to discuss the political implications of Spinoza's metaphysics, he feels that he has to. And I suppose, the general background of this question, if I can show my cards, so to speak, the general background of this question is obviously Marx. Marx is someone who you can consider as an ally of Spinoza, and Marx is someone who was, of course, immensely important for Pierre Machere's work and thinking, but also someone who does think historically. And I think the ultimate problem for any Spinozist, any Marxist who would want to make use of Spinoza would be that Spinoza doesn't really have a good or any concept of history at all. That in a sense, Spinoza's concepts, if we take them on a metaphysical level, are ahistoric. Spinoza doesn't really have a good theory of time even. Like, he does talk about time, infinity, finitude, he does, yes. But like, in comparison to other thinkers who have devoted like volumes of thought on this, specifically on Marx and the historical developments, Spinoza is clearly lacking. So I would say that this is a kind of negotiation with Spinoza. You want to appreciate Spinoza's political treatise and Spinoza's theological political treatise, but you also want to, push or test his concepts as to what extent are they malleable to Marxism. Like, this would, the claim would be, of course, that history is something that, Spinoza could have or even should have thought about. And this is why these authors would push Spinoza's thought to the very limit. And of course, you can make a mistake and then claim that Spinoza's God is a God that changes, which, on a metaphysical level, is probably not. So I hope this answers your concerns. The open history that I think Machere wants to defend is obviously something that Machere wants to deny that Spinoza was a fatalist. This is what Machere wants to do. Spinoza was definitely not a fatalist, and therefore, if we want to make any sense of his political thought, we have to drop the notion that determinacy means that there's no change. Pina Totaro on Wednesday actually found a really good, I'm not sure if she's here today. Oh, sorry, hi. So she found a really good reference in Spinoza's letter to Oldenburg, where he says really directly, I am not a fatalist. When I talk about necessity of things, I am not a fatalist. I do not talk about fate. The world is not fated. And so, yes, it is possible to defend the idea of open history in Spinoza, I think.
We have two more questions, at least Zanan first, and then Anton.
Thanks, Gregor. It was really thought-provoking, and I enjoyed it a lot. Since you called it as a crazy idea, well, it's actually on, but it doesn't work. I don't know why.
No.
I think it maybe just takes some time.
You hear me? Yeah, I hear myself, at least. Since you were talking that it's a crazy idea, that there could be a thought of contingency in Spinoza itself. And then, after your thought-provoking presentation, I just asked myself, what would you think that maybe it was Deleuze who had a kind of Spinoza's contingency already? If you think that he even, it was a vitalist contingent thinking with Spinoza, if you just think how he thinks the virtuality, which is infinite, and how virtuality actualizes itself, and how the difference repeats itself, and this is actually a way of thinking contingency with Spinoza par excellence. And how would how would you relate?
I would say absolutely yes. The only reason why I didn't go into Deleuze was simply because I did that years ago. So I wanted to explore other authors. That's the only reason. But yes, of course, Deleuze would be a... No, it's not your ignorance. It's... I should have mentioned probably Deleuze is a good example of someone who also devoted his life work, if you want to say, or at least his doctoral thesis, to try to pursue the crazy in Spinoza.
Okay. Anton?
Does it work? Yeah. So I have one question on Hegel and another on Spinoza. On Hegel, well, I was surprised to hear you kind of initially said that he's a Parmenidean thinker, and it appears that contingency has no place or has no ontological value because, well, I mean, he's critical of Parmenides. He thinks Parmenides is at best the sort of first step, which, you know, like is aufgehoben. And as far as contingency, I think it's everywhere in Hegel's actual system, right? I mean, you talked about one example in the history, but it's also in nature. It's the realm of contingency in subjective spirit, objective spirit, you know, like everywhere. So yeah, that was a bit like seemed like obviously there is plenty of place of contingency in Hegel, and even when he says it's something that should be overcome theoretically and practically. Right? If we need to overcome it practically, it already presupposes that it is it exists. Right? It sort of gives us some kind of resistance. So yeah, that's on Hegel. But I guess ultimately you sort of agree with it. But Spinoza, I just want to clarify this concept of post festum necessity. I guess. So what exactly does it mean? So does it mean that some things are not causally determined by prior causes? Because I think then that would be wrong. Even human actions, like you said many times, right? It's determined by prior causes of which we are not conscious, right? So that's why we think we are free. Or maybe it can mean that this chain of causes itself is, like some of the formulations seem to suggest that the chains of causes themselves are contingent. So then it would be a position, some sort of like Edwin Curtis, right? That he's not a necessitarian, but a causal determinist, but the causal chains themselves are contingent, right? So something like that. Is that where you're going to, or not?
Thank you, Anton. So yeah, I think you've responded your own question with regard to Hegel. It was just the initial push, like initial sort of thing to say. Like, I mean, there's a reason why Hegel would say that the beginning is the beginning with philosophers like Parmenides, who deny that contingence, like this is the beginning of science. Contingency is nothing. It is only in the second step that Hegel develops this thought a little bit further. With regard to Spinoza, so the way I understand this post festum necessity, ultimately, it would mean that you cannot reduce all causality to efficient causality, which, of course, again, is heretical to think in Spinoza. But yes, this would be the idea. And of course, Spinoza shows really clearly how external teleology is basically ridiculous. But I feel that that's not a problem for thinkers like Kant or Hegel or any other thinkers who would nevertheless think about the divine providence as having making some sort of sense. And I suppose my ultimate claim would be, which is what I said at the end, that, you know, if Spinoza had heard of the specific Hegel version of divine providence, he might not necessarily be so much against it as he is against the ludicrous notion of divine providence. This is all I'm saying. So post festum necessity already implies that there's, you know, that you cannot explain everything merely through efficient causality. And with regard to the question of, you know, does that mean that there is some freedom or contingency on the level of the very choice of the causal chains? No, absolutely not. That would probably be Leibniz. Leibniz has this idea of possible worlds. Like once you have a world, it's strictly necessitarian. But there's possible worlds. Spinoza, no, absolutely not. So if you can talk about causality, which is not reducible to efficient causality, I think you have to start talking about immanent causality. This is where this is where you can, this is where you can find some divergence from the strict efficient causality that otherwise he professes.
Okay. Thank you, Gregor, again. So